Good afternoon. Buenos tardes. Konnichiwa. My name is Anthea Hartig, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Elizabeth Macmillan Director of your National Museum of American History. It's truly a joy to welcome you here today, especially on my 5th anniversary of serving as director, and I'm the first woman to hold that position. I like to say that no other woman will ever have to say that again. But before we begin, let us pause with gratitude in our hearts to acknowledge this layered landscape on which we sit and learn and listen and share in community today. In the greater Washington, D.C. area, we acknowledge the precedents of the Piscataway and the Nacotchtank and the Powmonkey tribes and their descendants. This is a humble but incomplete acknowledgement, of course, but it helps us remember the significance of place, our ongoing commitment to build lasting relationships with our Indigenous colleagues and friends as we are all here together. I am very deeply honored to be here. I'm very grateful for our incredible partnership who makes today and every event like this happen. The Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, today the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, the Japanese American Citizens League, all our distinguished guests here gathered, welcome for the 82nd commemoration of Executive Order 9066. Among many others, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome the Honorable Minister Masaharu Sato, the head of Chancery at the Embassy of Japan to the United States, to the museum. Thank you, Your Excellency. This year's sponsors hold a special place in this program, including, of course, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and the Roosevelt Institute, the Japanese American Citizen League, both national and DC chapter. We have a number of wonderful young volunteers as well as board members here. Patty Hirahara, who is an inspiration for this year's program, as well as a donor and a guiding light. Nora Yutimatsu, who was formerly incarcerated at Heart Mountain and a Korean War veteran who's with us today and whose generous donation also helped make this program happen, but who hand-carried special objects from his military service just this morning, working with our curator, Jennifer Jones, to add to the national collection. So we're so thankful to you, Corporal. I would also like to acknowledge the many dedicated supporters of the museum's Japanese American History Endowment, the SF Gasho Trust, the Terasaki Family Foundation, Advanced Fresh Concepts, Hawaii Air Cargo Incorporated, Ronald Yashino, Patty Hirahara, Terry K. Takeda, Mary Hirahara, Tom Yoshimama, Dr. Himeo Tsumori, all of whom help us continue this important work at the museum. And without my very special colleagues, some of whom I've mentioned, but including Noriko Sanofuji, Theo Gonzalez, Dan Holm, Magdalena Mari, Mike Johnson, Vleska Hilbig, Bob Batley, Eden Cho, Rick Lee from the Asian Pacific American Center. Thank you all to my staff. I know a number of you are here today. I saw Carrie Cacho. As you know, this kind of truly takes a small village, and I'm so grateful for your dedication, for your commitment, and all you do to preserve this annual commemoration. So I started my public history career in 1990, and I was mentioning to Erica that I cannot imagine my time and on this pale blue dot without my relationships with the Asian American and Asian Pacific Islander communities. It has been a true humbling honor to learn, to explore together, to reveal, to preserve the complicated legacies surrounding this moment, this day of remembrance. But in general, it's been such an incredible experience. To work in these fields from the Harada House in Riverside, California, to the Minidoka incarceration camp in rural south central Idaho, and now here at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. So I extend my lasting gratitude to each of you, individually, collectively, to all of our Nikkei sisters and brothers who have come before us, the ancestors, and to those who are here now and in the future who will carry this work, who will cherish it, and who will bring it forward. Here at the museum, our mission is to empower people to create a more just and compassionate future by exploring the complexities, by understanding the ways in which we can share the various contours of the United States past. And we see public history, the work we do in public with our communities, and of course here in Washington, but throughout the nation and world, as an important educational component, of course, to our civic lives, but really the underpinning of a democratic society. Learning history helps us understand today's world is not inevitable. It's the result of a myriad of choices and actions made by individuals and communities. At this moment of continuing global and intersecting crises, we're all, of course, experiencing some form of grief and loss and fear. And the Smithsonian's efforts, led by the Secretary Lonnie G. Bunch III, to reckon with our racial past and to explore the legacies of racism in the United States, can bring forth, especially when carefully done and warmingly crafted and honestly prepared, reconciliation. And panel discussions like the one today can bring together differing viewpoints and can be incredibly powerful. And especially here, it's important that we have an open dialogue with the Japanese American community with whom we have included in this program for close to 20 years. Folding in the FDR Library and Museum and the Roosevelt Institute, both the descendants of the Roosevelt, and Perrin Ireland is here, who you'll hear from in a minute, internees, their descendants. Bringing that all together into conversation helps us transform our shared understanding of the past as we explore its complexities and its lived experiences. We remain committed and grateful to share with Smithsonian audiences both here in the building and online for generations to come. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce a friend and an inspiration who is the Deputy Assistant to the President of the United States for Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Senior Liaison, appointed in April of 2021, Erica Mortsigugu.
Thank you. You are taller than I am. Thank you, Dr. Hardig, for that generous introduction and also for lowering the mic for me. I'm incredibly honored to be here with you all today. I wanted to start with a heartfelt thank you to the Smithsonian, the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, to the Japanese American Citizens League, and my dear friend Noriko Sanefuji, and Dr. Yu, who's you'll hear from soon, for annually hosting a Day of Remembrance and always celebrating the rich history and contributions of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in our great nation. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of a colleague, Kendi Yamaguchi, who is the highest ranking Japanese American at the Department of Commerce and who was just honored agency-wide by Secretary Raimondo. Kendi. Look, y'all, I'm incredibly honored to be with you all today to honor our history and to share President Biden's Day of Remembrance statement. President Biden's statement marking this year's Day of Remembrance issued just this morning. Thank you, Magdalena. And it's dated today, February 19th, 2024. And he says, on this day in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the forcible incarceration of over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent, half of whom were children. It was shameful. Families were separated, communities were torn apart, people were stripped of their dignity, and the unconstitutional and unconscionable policy was even upheld by the Supreme Court. In the face of injustice, 33,000 Japanese Americans stepped up and courageously served in the US military during World War II. They demonstrated loyalty and patriotism. We honor these servicemen and women, as well as the legacy of civil rights leaders like Fred Korematsu, Minoru Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Mitsue Endo, along with every Japanese American who organized and worked to right a wrong. Their sacrifice, their resilience, and their belief that civil liberties and freedom must be vigorously defended inspire us today. I decided to run for president to restore the soul of America, to confront racism, xenophobia, and hate in all its forms, to strengthen and preserve our democracy. We remember the tragic legacy of Executive Order 9066 and the trauma it inflicted by reaffirming the federal government's formal apology to Japanese Americans and by stating unequivocally, Nidoto nai yoni, to not let it happen again. And these are President Biden's words. Now, I stand in front of you all today as a proud Yonsei, a fourth-generation Japanese American who grew up in Hawaii around the notion of Okage-sama Day. I know I pronounced that wrong. Sorry, embassy folks. Whatever I am today, it's because of you. Like many of you here today, I personally had many people in my family who were impacted by Executive Order 9066 as unjustly incarcerated Japanese Americans, and who had family who valiantly served in World War II, such as my grandfather, Richard Moritsugu, in the MIS, and my great-uncle Masato Nakai, Uncle Curly, Uncle Haruto Ronald Kuroda, both of whom received the Medal of Honor for serving in the 100th Battalion. Now, at the same time, my great-grandfather and great-great-uncle were arrested and imprisoned at Honouliuli in Hawaii. My great-great-uncle was transported to a New Mexico incarceration camp under the accusation simply of being a leader of his fishing village in Kaneohe, Hawaii. It is these shoulders that I stand upon that has impacted my career and service today. My motivation for public service is crystal clear. Just like President Biden says, I'm committed to prevent similar atrocities from happening again. Nidoto nai yoni. I'm proud to fight for social justice, to fight hate, and to empower communities and individuals. It is definitely hard work, but Okage-sama de, I am who I am because of you, and that is my honor to serve in your legacy. Since the beginning of the administration, President Biden and Vice President Harris have committed to empowering and uplifting Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander individuals, families, and communities. It is with their support that we are able to address many issues affecting our community. Just last week, the National Park Service formally established the Amachi incarceration site as a part of the National Park Service. It is one of the 10 incarceration camps, and in Amachi, in Granada, Colorado, 10,000 people were incarcerated. And I'm going to kind of paraphrase what Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland and NPS Director Sam said as a reminder that a complete account of the nation's history must include our dark chapters of injustice so that we can heal and grow as a nation. And that's the President's charge to me and to you, and our honor to serve. So on behalf of the White House, thank you for allowing me to share this space with you today. Mahalo nui loa.
Mahalo, sister. That was very beautiful and moving, and that call to service is so inspirational. Please do thank the president for us, and thank you and your team. I know some of your team is here today for all that you do. It's an honor to have so many incredible people in the audience, and they keep on trickling in, which is beautiful. And I'm especially grateful to all of our long-term partners, as I said before. One of course, the most important of those is the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, and it's an honor to welcome Dr. Yao Fan Yu of APAC to the stage. Yao Fan is charged with ensuring the comprehensive representation of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders in the Smithsonian's collections, research, exhibition, and programs. Since joining the Smithsonian from APAC, from the Cooper Hewitt Museum in 2022, that's our Smithsonian Design Museum in New York, Dr. Yu has actively expanded APAC's education, publication, and public programming initiatives, including planning for the upcoming exhibitions and gallery here on the National Mall and actually here in the American History Museum. Yao-Fen has held curatorial positions at the Detroit Institute of Arts and the J. Paul Getty Museum, and it's an honor to welcome her to the stage.
Thank you, Anthea, for so generously setting the stage for today's crucial conversation. And thank you, Erica, for sharing President Biden's statement. I'm Yao-Fen Yu, the Acting Director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, also known as APAC, and I'm honored to join you this afternoon for the Smithsonian Annual Day of Remembrance program in partnership with the National Museum of American History on this very important occasion. APAC's late founding director, Dr. Franklin Odo, started the Smithsonian's Day of Remembrance programming in the early 2000s, and we're proud that this vital tradition has continued. At APAC, we're committed to amplifying and uplifting the stories of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And the incarceration of Japanese Americans stands as one of the most significant and shameful moments in our nation's history. To ensure that this history is taught in schools, we've partnered with the National Veterans Network on various initiatives. Last summer, we held a 3-day in-person teacher training workshop here in DC at this very museum for elementary and middle school teachers. Last week, we hosted a virtual webinar with Ken Mochizuki, the author of the children's book, Baseball Saved Us. In May, we'll offer another webinar focusing on Japanese American resettlement. In 2012, on the 70th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066, Dr. Odo moderated the Smithsonian's Day of Remembrance program, featuring a presentation by Secretary of Veteran Affairs, General Eric Shinseki. Dr. Odo highlighted a paradox about the telling and sharing of stories of Japanese Americans during World War II across the generations. Dr. Odo explained that many older Japanese Americans keep their narratives to themselves because they feel it is not for them to tell, while younger generations fail to elicit this important historic material as they believe it is not for them to ask. Dr. Odo's profound insight underscores the importance of intergenerational dialogue in preserving our history. As we honor the sacrifices and resilience of Japanese Americans today, let us heed Dr. Odo's call to action, to not only listen to the voices of the past, but to actively engage with and pass on their stories, ensuring that the lessons learned from this dark chapter in our history are never forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yao-Fen, for all that you do for sharing Franklin's beautiful words. He was so special to so many of us, and to all that you and your colleagues at APAC have done for all of us here at American History. Of course, this event is in collaboration with you and your colleagues, and our wonderful new partners at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, and of course our long-term partnerships and friendships with the Japanese American Citizen League. So we're incredibly honored to welcome this conversation today. You'll hear this exploration, I think, across time, across generations, and across communities of the incredible nature of and the contours of this emotional, cultural, historic landscape. So I'm honored to welcome up to the stage William Harris, Director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, Perrin Ireland artist and biologist and great-granddaughter of Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, Dr. Madeline Hsu, professor and director of the Center for Global Migration Studies at the University of Maryland, and of course moderated by our friend and inspiration David Inoue, the executive director of the Japanese American Citizen League. As they come up and have their panel conversation, we'll also be passing out little index cards for your questions. They'll be collected at the end of the panel, and we of course encourage you to ask the panelists questions, which then David will moderate. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to David.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to the museum for hosting us, to APAC as well for your wonderful support for this program over the years, and of course Franklin Otto. Remember him as really the person who got all this started for us all. I'm going to probably dispense with the introductions. I think that we want to get right to the meat of things here. We're going to start off with each of them is going to sort of do a little presentation, and then we'll move into more of a dialogue. And as Anthony had mentioned, we're asking you to put your questions on those index cards and have those. We'll have those collected later on in the program. So Madeline, why don't we start off with you? I believe you have a formal presentation. Sort of set the table for us, a little bit of context for what happened.
Hello, I am going to give the historical background. This year is also the 100th anniversary of the most restrictive immigration law in our nation's history. And it helps us understand the use of immigration and citizenship restrictions that were racially based that then make Japanese Americans vulnerable for incarceration when we come to World War II. So I'm going to this is a very densely packed slide to understand the impetus to enact these really restrictive laws, which made into permanent immigration law quantitative restrictions on immigration into the United States. This really happens only in the 1920s. It has become the spine of immigration regulation today. I also want to thank May Nye, who's in the audience, who's a lot of this scholarship was, and thinking about immigration regulation was actually shows up in May's book, Impossible Subjects. And so, no, we didn't want to go there. So you can see this shows us overall levels of legal immigration into the United States across time, and we can see like 1890s into the early 20th century, there are peaking levels, mostly from Europe. Congress very much wanted to restrict immigration, really wanted to limit immigration numerically, but the challenge was that most of the immigrants were coming from Europe. At this juncture, by the 1920s, Congress had already taken steps to enact all but end Chinese immigration, there was an entire barred zone of which covered most of Asia from which people were not supposed to enter. But the challenge at this juncture is that if you really wanted to limit and to reduce immigration, you had to somehow come up with a legal strategy to do so in application to Europeans. And this was a harder nut to crack. Asians had been restricted from coming on a racial basis. They had also been restricted from gaining citizenship by naturalization on a racial basis. If you were an Asian immigrant, you could not get US citizenship no matter how much you tried. By the 1920s, we also have Japanese American, Takeo Ozawa, we have Bhagat Singh Thind, an Asian Indian, had thrown themselves at this racial barrier on citizenship, and both had been turned down at the level of the Supreme Court. Okay, so all of these racial barriers had been set up, but to really restrict European immigration, what Congress ended up doing was to set a absolute quantitative cap. right? So, and this is why we see this dramatic decline in numbers into 1930s. It didn't matter what caliber of person you were, what sort of educational attainment, what your potential, what your aspiration was, if you ran up against what are called the national origins quotas, right? And so this is the table of actual quotas. This comes from Mae Nye's book. And this was based on census counts in the United States dating back to the 1890s. A flat percentage of that population in the country at that time designated the quotas, right? And so suddenly the only legal immigrants are, I think the total is about 150,000 per year. And you have a dramatic sudden drop, right? You can also see that the quotas set up in this way are different, right? So the main criteria for your legal entry into the United States becomes your national origin, right? This is the chief consideration in terms of legal immigration. You can also see that certain countries, such as Germany, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, get huge quotas. Also the Irish Free State. Italy's quota looks not that bad, almost 6,000, but if you consider previously over 100,000 Italians had been coming per year, right? You can see that suddenly there is this extreme constriction, right? And this list of quotas also shows us the biases in the immigration laws. Northern and Western European countries receive about 85% of all of the quotas, right? And so this system of national origins remains in place until 1965. It renders quantitatively visible, very obvious, the United States' national prejudices against actually most people from around the world, including Eastern and Southern Europeans. Now, you may ask, what about Asians, right? And you can see that a country like Japan does have a small quota of 100, but if you look at the footnote, that 100 is for persons who happened to be born in Japan, but were eligible for citizenship. Right? Because another thing that the 1924 law does is it bans altogether immigration by aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? And this was a legal code term for Asians, right? So I explained Asians had been barred from getting citizenship as a race by naturalization. Okay, so bans altogether immigration by aliens ineligible for citizenship. Congress does this, knowing that it will be an open insult to the Japanese government. The Japanese government for a long time has understood that when your people are singled out for immigration restriction, it is an open slap in the face in terms of international relations. And so the Japanese government up to this time has very concertedly been campaigning against this, does not want to be called out in US immigration laws. This is why we had the gentleman's agreement, okay? But at the juncture of 1924, Congress no longer cares that this will upset the Japanese government, right? It worsens what already were tense relationships between the United States and Japan, and it also renders even more clear the hardening of racial lines that had been happening in the United States up across the teens and the 20s, particularly targeting Asian immigrants and descendants of Asian immigrants. And so during this time period, 19-teens, 1920s, we had the alien land laws in California most prominently, but in many states across the West, which targeted aliens ineligible for citizenship and severely restricted their rights to land ownership. And Japanese had entered into farming disproportionately in hopes of emulating European immigrants and settlers who had gone exactly into these fields. They wanted to demonstrate, yes, we can be compatible, yes, we can fit into this trajectory of immigrant adaptation. The alien land laws particularly targeted Japanese Americans to seek to remove them, to unsettle them, to thwart their capacities to actually sink roots as farmers. And again, Japanese Americans had challenged these laws in court, and the laws had been ruled constitutional on the basis of their alien status as non-citizens, as immigrants into the United States. And this helps us to understand the vulnerabilities of Japanese Americans when we get to World War II. After 1924, with all the adverse decisions in terms of citizenship, in terms of the discriminatory alien land laws, we actually have Japanese Americans doing an assessment of their situation in the United States. And we know that there were significant numbers of Japanese Americans who, in fact, finding that they cannot gain purchase in the US, who go on and try to find their way in other places, places like Brazil, places like Manchuria. This is also the legal situation that makes them vulnerable when we get to Executive Order 9066. And the finding is that all Japanese Americans on the West Coast, regardless of nativity, regardless of citizenship, are found to be enemy aliens for the purposes of national security. Military necessity was the claim that then required that they be rounded up and placed in incarceration camps for the duration of the war. And I think many of the people here will be familiar with the sort of flaws in that justification. For example, there never was actually a military crisis on the West Coast. The Japanese military would not have been able to attack the West Coast in the way that it was claimed. But there's this whole history of racialization of others, of being threats, and of having limited rights. So I am going to stop here, and thank you.
Thank you, Madeline. Well, a lot of information in 10 minutes. So to kind of set the stage, sort of like what was happening in the 1920s, obviously FDR became president in the 1930s, sort of where you see that big dip in that chart. But Bill, if you can maybe provide a little bit of context of maybe even a little bit of why are you here as the FDR, sort of a representative of the FDR library and museum.
Yeah, that's absolutely, thanks. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Smithsonian and Thea, as well as Japanese American Citizens League, and my fellow panelists today, including Madeline and Perrin. And I especially want to, and I feel it's important as the director of the FDR Library that I do this, to express to survivors of incarceration and their families who have borne the burden and the consequences of this grave injustice for generations, not just during the years of incarceration or immediately afterwards, but for generations, that the FDR Library is committed to the redress of President Roosevelt's promulgation of the executive order, and in seeking to provide context for this decision, his decisions, the library will not make excuses for what was a wrong then, just as it is a wrong now and would remain so. So that is our commitment. Among those who disagreed with FDR at the time, and there were those, actually in the 1930s, people within the military and within government were already looking at the Japanese American communities. This didn't just spring up in 1942. These views, as Madeline set forth, had long found their roots and germinated within the way in which the American government, as well as the American military, viewed Japanese American communities, not only in Hawaii, but certainly on the West Coast and in the Western states. There were those, however, who disagreed with these policies, and in 1941-42, after Pearl Harbor, who most certainly did, in fact, disagree, saw immediately how unconstitutional this would be. So this isn't something that was imposed later on the history. Those voices did exist at that time. Eleanor Roosevelt was among them, the First Lady herself. I never like to sanctify anyone from the past because that's always a dangerous game. But by the same token, her views were clear. She couldn't always express them publicly in the way she would have liked. She did not do that on many issues that she felt strongly about. But she also appreciated the value of working within a system, not always publicly, to accomplish change, as well as to make strong symbolic gestures, which symbolism is great. It doesn't ever go far enough, but it can certainly be powerful. And she did this by visiting the Gila River Camp, and at the White House in 1943, greeting at the White House in 1943, only a year after the promulgation of the executive order, by greeting representatives of the Japanese American Citizens League. And there's a note to that. They presented her with a painting by Kira Obata. He was a professional artist and taught in California. And he painted a painting at the Topaz Camp, which the League presented to her, and which she kept with her and in her home and apartment for the rest of her life. And Mrs. Roosevelt wasn't necessarily an overtly sentimental person, but when she believed in something deeply, then that might evidence itself in many different ways. And in one way, which might seem like to some a small gesture, to her that had deep meaning to her, because it represented also potentially an area where she could have publicly perhaps said more. She never did publicly say a great deal in contradiction to the president's policy, but what she did do was evidence through her actions that it was not acceptable to her, and it certainly didn't represent any aspect of what the ideals upon which this country, we hope, were founded on, and that we've certainly worked towards. For too many years, part of the silence that fell to so many Americans and people within government who did not speak out about this, the FDR Library has remained largely silent about incarceration too. At times, the library even justified the president's decision as regrettable but understandable considering the conditions of the time. That did begin to change, and I think it's important for institutions, so I do want to speak a little bit about what our institution has tried to do, because I think until institutions such as a presidential library acknowledge these things and commit to them and begin to change publicly, then they're failing in their responsibilities as public institutions. I feel that deeply, and our organization does too. Well over a decade ago, when we redid our permanent exhibit, this important aspect of our history finally found its place. As we look now towards redoing the exhibit again, we will readdress that, and we will speak about it in an even different way. Over the past decade, too, we have also incorporated this into public and education programs. We're up in Hyde Park. It's not always as visible up there on the estate of President Roosevelt, but we have been working in our way, and we want to do more. We don't say that, I want to be real clear, for some kind of pat on the back, or it's because we deserve any sort of notice. But again, as a commitment publicly that this is what we must do, it's what we should do. Thank you. But as an archival institution, too, we've been evolving, as well as a museum. I'm not a historian. I've never pretended to be. I've never wanted to be one. I'm an archivist. The Library and Museum is part of the National Archives. We interpret history, but foundational to our operations is our fundamental responsibility to care for and make available the evidence. It's important to always think of this as evidence, documenting FDR's life and career, that of Eleanor's too, and the administration, and the people of the time. We don't just have to tell the story of the leaders and their official decisions, but of the people who also were impacted by those decisions, but who also attempted to have their voices heard and to speak to power. Because these documents, this evidence belongs to all of us. This doesn't belong to me or to the staff of the library. And the library, just like the Smithsonian, as Anthea pointed out, this is yours, and so are those materials. The library, I feel this is important to say, especially on a day like this, isn't the official organ of any one person, no person, not even the person whose name is on the building. or any political party or partisan activity. FDR had the foresight to grant public ownership through the National Archives to his presidential papers. We began our work in 1940 while he was still president. Those public papers, that in doing that he would actually set the stage so that now we can have frank assessments and look at these stories is rather remarkable and perhaps even ironic. And it is our responsibility to do this because that is what we're here for. So, in speaking about questions of memory and youth today, looking forward to the future, what young people know, how they find out about things, that history, as we all see in our community, and our communities across the country, history can be something far distant and into the past, when really it's right here with us at all time. We live with every single aspect of it, every single day. And we have this ability to influence our future based on that. So that it's essential that we acknowledge injustice, but in doing so, that does not mean that we're damning our whole democracy, that we're somehow pulling something down. I always say this, I always say it, that if we had the strength of character and purpose to defeat fascism around the world during World War II, then most certainly we've got the strength of character to take a good hard look at our history today and try not to repeat those errors. That takes some courage. It's not about tearing down and weakness. It's about understanding and building up and doing better. The fear after Pearl Harbor was real. There was all sorts of fear. People were afraid by the surprise attack. But as so often in our history, this fear burned like a wildfire, fueled by prejudice and race hatred. EO 966 almost seems like an inevitable outcome in some ways to that, since racism and reason won't ever be reconciled. However, it must never be inevitable. It can't be inevitable. And that's our responsibility, right? To those, and there are these, who assert that we mustn't hold past leaders accountable according to contemporary values, I would tell them, if they haven't, or if they already have, they should look again. They should look in the archives at the evidence, or sometimes the lack of evidence. Frank and unyielding it is, because it proves the ignorance and fallaciousness of such assertions. These critics guard our history with a sort of stifling reverence, I call it, which does a disservice to the complexity of all of our own humanity, as well as to individual leaders like FDR. So I want to close by quoting from a dissent in Korematsu versus the United States, because the dissenting opinions in the Korematsu case are rather remarkable and quite powerful and quite frank. And what they should do is lay to waste any notion that we're applying some sort of contemporary view sometimes to the past, because that wasn't, that's not the case here. Supreme Court Justice Frank Murphy, whose words remain true today as they were in 1944, are worth repeating whenever fear threatens reason and rational thought. He wrote in Korematsu, "I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination in any form and in any degree has no justifiable part whatever in our democratic way of life. It is unattractive in any setting, but it is utterly revolting among a free people who have embraced the principles set forth in the Constitution of the United States." Utterly revolting. It doesn't get clearer than that, does it? And the FDR Library unhesitatingly agrees with that, and we will work into the future to prove always that our institution is, in fact, everyone's institution, and your stories will be respectfully represented there always. So, thank you.
So the museum has been doing a lot for about 10 or so years, and part of that was actually kicked off by Perrin. You put together, you do a lot with artwork and how to retell stories, and you put together a video a few years, about 10 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Perrin Roosevelt Ireland, and I'm a great-granddaughter of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I want to thank you so much for the honor of getting to join you for the Day of Remembrance here at the Smithsonian. I want to express my gratitude on behalf of my family for being included in the ongoing act of remembering, understanding, honoring, and mourning this tragedy, which should never have happened. I want to share my appreciation for the grace which has been extended to us and to the library, that we get to be here to have conversations about healing. How important it is that we keep this conversation alive as time passes since the incarceration. Whether it is the incarceration exhibit the library hosted several years ago, or the honoring of Fred Korematsu posthumously through our For Freedoms Awards Freedom Medal in 2020, we, the family, know we cannot go back and change the past, but we want you to know we are working to participate deeply in collective healing, awareness, and ongoing conversation about the generational trauma the incarceration event imposed on Japanese Americans. I see this as honoring my great-grandparents' legacy. FDR created the National Archives and presidential libraries so that we, the people, could learn from and engage with our history. It is in keeping with his legacy to interrogate his legacy. He set the conditions for our indictments. I work as an artist and an illustrator. I've spent my career telling the stories of underrepresented or voiceless groups, including visual stories about the environment. I've illustrated fights for environmental injustice, visualizing the work of communities most impacted by climate change to protect their homes, livelihoods, and families. At present, I particularly focus on telling the stories of endangered animals and the brilliance with which they live their lives on an increasingly imperiled planet Earth. I have gotten to work with the FDR Library to animate and illuminate some of the stories of the legacy of FDR's administration. In doing so, I work to literally reanimate the library archives, to bring these stories to audiences today, to maintain a sense of connection to our past so that we may celebrate it or interrogate it. We learn from it either what we do want to keep doing or what we know we want to prevent from ever happening again. The library got a filmmaking grant from the state of New York in 2017, and we worked together with my co-producer, Flora Lichtman, to create an animated film to accompany the library's exhibit, looking candidly at the Japanese American incarceration. We looked at photographs, letters, newspaper columns, and speeches in the archive, and we worked to animate images of this horrific, violent act that created so much pain and trauma for hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans. For me, the act of taking a black and white photograph by, say, Lang or Iwasaki and literally animating it is a way to keep that history present and urgent, and to make sure it is something we feel and connect to viscerally and continue to learn from. So going through hundreds of photos of Japanese American human beings, dressed up, carrying all of the belongings that they could carry with them on short notice, with actual tags on them waiting in line for the bus, and then working to put that back into motion, not only transformed my understanding of this demeaning and devastating executive order, it also forever changed me. Zooming in on images to make sure I render each face with as much respect and precision as I can. Animating Eleanor walking through a camp in an unprecedented act of witnessing by a First Lady the harms being perpetuated by her husband's administration. Developing that kind of intimacy with these historical documents that I know make their impact felt today was not only a gift for me in truly getting to understand the impact of this event that FDR set in motion, to the best of my limited ability as a witness many years later who did not experience it. It is also the way that I know best for how to honor the lives and resilience and strength of the people who were incarcerated. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share with you this video telling the story of the incarceration. I want to flag that you will see and hear the word internment spoken throughout. We know that language changes over time, and that the preferred term, even just 6 years later, is incarceration, and we are going to update the film accordingly. Thank you again for letting me be here. Let us now see the video. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, prompting America to enter World War II. The war heightened racist attitudes and anti-Japanese sentiment grew. Many suspected their Japanese American neighbors might be spies or saboteurs. The military pressured President Roosevelt to take action. On February 19, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which made it legal to relocate Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans were taken from their homes, some of which were seized by white Americans. They could only bring with them what they could carry, and were shipped to remote relocation centers. Once at the camps, they essentially became prisoners. Nearly 2/3 of people interned were native-born American citizens. Over 1,000 young people from the camps volunteered for military service. Eleanor Roosevelt strongly opposed the internment. She visited one of the camps and urged FDR to lift the order.
We must not forget this. We must realize that one cannot tell the difference between a citizen and a non-citizen by just looking at him, by seeing the color of his skin, or by hearing him talk.
In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled that the government's actions were constitutional. In January 1945, the executive order was rescinded. The internees were released. In 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt helped draft the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which prohibits the incarceration of innocent civilians.
We must want our fellow human beings to have rights and freedoms which give them dignity and which will give them a sense that they are human beings that can walk the earth with their heads high and look all men in the face. If we observe these rights for ourselves and for others, I think we will find that it is easier in the world to build peace.
So thank you for that. A great way of presenting this that's probably a little more accessible to some people than perhaps accessing the archives directly. Right. not that there's anything, and certainly that's one way to learn about this. But actually, I'd kind of like to go in that direction, though. And Madeline, obviously you provide some of the historical context as a historian. Bill is an archivist. What does that tell us, both from the historian perspective, the context around what it, as the build-up, and you provided a little bit of it with the immigration laws, but there was a lot of other things that were happening, and other immigration laws as well. Chinese Exclusion Act, which we just, this past year was the 50th anniversary of the repeal of that, actually. But then also, Bill, what is it in the archives that tells us about sort of the state of mind of the president and the first lady at the time as all these decisions were being made?
Well, it was interesting. I was talking with Madeline just for a second before the program, because what the archives at the FDR Library, and what many people don't realize about these Presidential Library archives, is that we have the papers and records, certainly, of the president and the first lady, and some senior members of the administration. And so we see, and the various White House files from the time. So what we see are, sometimes in a rather bureaucratic way, the formulation and the promulgation and the implementation of policies that sometimes sound disconnected from people. They sound like one might expect a government record to sound like. And there's a dehumanizing quality, and that can be about any of them. But when you know you're speaking about something that is so deeply personal and real, it feels almost surreal. President Roosevelt did not keep a diary, so we never really know what he's thinking or what his reactions are. We see him reflected in others, but often only through various policies or speeches do we have a way of sort of reading what he's thinking. But what we do have at the library, and this is true of Mrs. Roosevelt, who interacted with the government certainly and interacted with the public in a different way, are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of letters from the American people. And we have letters from the American people that are fully supportive of the president on a range of issues over the 12 years. But also those Americans who very much don't support the president. That surprises many people. We also have the negative as well as the positive. And through those letters, through those materials, which so frequently aren't valued by archives because that's just public mail, it's not the important papers of state, do you get this sense of the people interacting, of what you begin to get a hint of what the pulse of the nation might be in various parts of it, what issues matter to them. And I think through that combination of the official and that personal, you begin to get a sense of how an administration is both reacting to or leading and governing during a time of crisis.
I research immigration, migration studies, and something that we've been paying a lot of attention to is how powerful those laws are that regulate who can enter a country legally, who can also get citizenship. And in this day and age, it's very much assumed to be within the purview of national governments to make all of these decisions. One of the things we try to direct attention to, though, is as the United States starts becoming serious about restricting immigration, regulating who can legally immigrate, the primary criteria were race and national origins. And this is true in national law until 1965. And we can understand incarceration as the absolute nadir of this in US history. I mean, if we wanted to look elsewhere for an even worse example, we can look at what happened to Jewish people in Germany and in Europe during World War II. But there was this strong belief that your race was an essential quality, a determinant of who you were as a people, your culture and your civilization, and that governments therefore were justified in having these kinds of immigration regulations and limitations on citizenship that mark you out on the basis of your race. And we see this happening to Japanese Americans, the US-born Japanese American citizens that are summarily banned from being on the West Coast because only of their race, right? And there are all kinds of other motivations that were part of this. Many people wanted the land that they had so carefully cultivated. But it was also, and I really appreciate parents' representation because it's an attempt to humanize them, right? But there's one of the terrible things that happens when you are being racially discriminatory is that you dehumanize people, you don't see them as sort of your equal, as sort of your neighbor, and you're willing to let them be treated in these ways. I mean, this was not across the board. There were people who objected, but it's and it is important to remember that these kinds of racial discriminations, I mean, from my perspective, are also embedded into our immigration laws. And they have real-world impact because people who don't have status, who are considered aliens or who are considered unlawful immigrants, don't have the same rights and protections. And it is, I think, important for us to think about the impact, the implications of these systems of regulation.
Thank you. You mentioned humanization, and that's a big part of artwork, and that's where you work, Perrin. Can you talk a little bit about, in making this video, a big part of it is sort of telling that story of Eleanor Roosevelt, the United Nations, Declaration of Human Rights. What is the role of perhaps the family in some of this? Obviously from her perspective, but also your own perspective in telling the story.
What is the role of the family? Well, I can speak maybe first for myself and the opportunities I've had to interact with the legacy. So as I said, I get to be involved in different pieces, and I have since I was a child, of seeking to spend time with people that are grappling with different facets of the legacy. There's different components for me on a day-to-day basis. The library is associated with a think tank, the Roosevelt Institute, which has been mentioned today, a progressive economic think tank that I sit on the board of. And so there are family members that are involved in that are working to help implement progressive economic policies that represent the legacy of the progressive economics of the FDR administration today, day to day, to include everything from, working with the Biden administration on student debt relief, advocating for wiping medical debt off credit reports, a sort of range of Rooseveltian activities. As far as the library work goes, I've been so honored to get to participate as an artist and illustrator and really bring that piece of myself. And, every family member is so different in how they are interacting with the legacy and having conversations about it. I feel grateful to kind of get to slip into the archives and, as you see in the video, look at these photos, put them back in color, spend that time, with pen and ink, making sure to render them with as much respect as possible. And I feel really grateful as a family member to get to bring that. And, I have to say I have the benefit of being a great-grandchild, which is a little bit removed. And so much of what I've learned about their legacy does come from my family, but I tend to fact-check it against what's available. And so I know a lot about them also from biographies, and that's a different gaze on the administration and its impact, and I've been grateful for that as well.
Actually, you touched on something that I think we need to acknowledge here, is that we don't have anyone here on the stage that is a survivor of the incarceration experience. What does that mean for us as those who don't have that direct connection in telling this story to others, and how do we do that?
Perspective is we can't tell that story on our own. We don't have one. We're not experts in every topic, of course, or in every area of, and we're not historians. We work with historians. We have curators. We work with people. So we have to engage externally, but we also have to. We have to be better about engaging with communities, with people with lived experience, because that's going to turn around frequently, I think, how we would approach the story. We can do it very separately and above and sort of present it down in a very classically institutional way. But as we look forward, I think that it's important for us to recognize that if these institutions are everyone's, then everyone needs to help us tell the stories.
Being historian is trying to figure out how do you put yourself into situations in the past and try to recover as much as you can based on what fragments are available to be able to recover stories, recover conditions, see what kinds of decisions and choices were being made. I think in Asian American studies, which was really becoming more institutionalized in the 1960s, there was a lot of attention to the importance of things like oral history, that we needed also to go to families, that we need to try to emphasize the importance of the sort of records and traces that might not be in an official archive where very important people have all of these records attending them that then are preserved, but that the lives of just average people, but also people who were placed under such terrible circumstances really matter. And what are those traces? What can we preserve? But then to go on and try to tell the story as faithfully as we can. And artistic representations, I think, are certainly one of the ways that we can try to evoke what these experiences were like. But to But it is an ongoing challenge.
It is, yeah.
And I'm sure, speaking of visual representation, I'm sure that many folks here are familiar, and we talked about it this week, with Citizen 13660, which is a graphic novel by Mineo Kubo, which is really important to me on multiple levels. It's an incredible first-person document of this history and her experience being incarcerated in one of the camps. She was art directing newspapers while she was incarcerated, and then after she got out of a camp, published this graphic novel. It's also, for me, that graphic novel is incredibly important as an artist in looking at first-person perspective, because it's well known, at least in comics community, aside from the history, for the way she puts herself in each image. And I encourage you to check it out to see, but the way she chooses to present herself experiencing events and her participation in them or watching them is really profound in exactly the sense we're talking about that experience. And it's an interesting question too when I think about how the documents that I looked at to make that video. And Ian, as Bill says, one of the things I think is so incredible about the library is the primary documents and the correspondence. And there's an exhibit up right now, The Roosevelts and Civil Rights, that presents a lot of these letters. So it's extensive correspondence between, say, Eleanor Roosevelt and Pauli Murray, who first started writing FDR, the civil rights activist, to question him on policies. And it was Eleanor that wrote Pauli back, and they developed, I think, a 30-year friendship. That was, Pauli, as you may know if you're familiar with Pauli's work, held Eleanor accountable in those letters. So in making the video, we looked at letters that people had written Eleanor appealing to her. Japanese American soldiers and parents of Japanese American soldiers. And when I look at the video today, I see that we said she was opposed to it and went to visit a camp. Another way to tell that story, which I might do today, is what's a line from that letter, right, to allow a different voice to come through. So it's helpful to have these conversations to continue to change the way we tell these stories, too.
And I would like to add to that, I absolutely agree, because when you begin to look at that resource and privilege that alongside the great papers of state, then you, in so many archives, are those stories and voices. They've never been, equated with sort of important. They're there, but they're kind of over here, That's just public mail. That's classically sort of an archives perspective, especially when you get to an archives president. But wow, those are the voices of people, of everyday people speaking in their voice, writing. And it's just like, stop thinking about it from the perspective, well, frankly, from my perspective as the library director even, but from that president's viewpoint, and let's just let those letters talk to us. They're gonna tell us what was going on and what people were finding important if we just listen to them.
Thank you for mentioning the exhibit that's going on right now. And obviously, FDR was president at a very tumultuous time. There was, obviously, with what happened to Japanese Americans, there was the beginning of the civil rights movement as well. Obviously, the issue with the Jews and whether they could come into this country from to escape the Holocaust. A lot of things that the president was dealing with. One thing you had mentioned in your remarks, Bill, was that we don't want to use the excuse of sort of like the modern values or modern morals. Can we maybe talk a little bit about how have those values or morals, how have they been consistent, or how have they changed over time?
Well, I think this is where I would tend to go back to the question of, we can start, I suppose, in a sort of in a civil way in speaking in terms of our charters of freedom and the documents that technically underpin, the decisions that are made and the choices that are made. And so when I speak about values in that sense, and the way in which people speak about injustice or about the actions that were taken, that, it's when everything is politically freighted as it is, especially today. And it's the easy swipe is, you're just talking you're just using today's language to talk about those incidents. To me, it's important to bring the language out of the era to show that that's not some modern construct that we're applying to the past. It's not being applied to the past. It was active then. Questions of race and the civil rights movement, the formulation of what we popularly know as the sort of 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, which really was much longer in its scope. Those aren't. We're not making something today for political reasons and imposing it upon the past. It's there. And so we can be a God by the voices of the era. It's just, who are we listening to? And how are we challenging that? And I think that, you can challenge it in many ways. As I said, what's the evidence in the papers, but what's also the lack of evidence in the papers? That speaks in multiple different directions. So I just think that there are a set of values to me that are inherent about individual human dignity. You can argue about policies and how you approach, but there are certain core fundamentals that if we cannot acknowledge and talk about plainly as an institution, then we're somehow failing. We can't put it in terms of some policy question. It has to be put in those real and human terms. It was wrong then. It was dehumanizing. It was racist. It was then that way. It will always be that way. So we can talk about context and try to understand it and try not to make those, but there has to be a fundamental there, a foundation that we would agree with about the value and the respect we have for each other.
I would say it's important that we have learned from the past, but then there are many decisions, wrong decisions that were made in the past that are still with us. Mm-hmm. So, for example, the principle of military necessity, which the Supreme Court ruled justified the incarceration of all of these Japanese Americans as enemy aliens. That ruling, that justification remains on the books. It is a tool that is still available to the U.S. government, even as we have gone back and we have recovered this history and we have recognized, yes, there was wrongdoing against Fred Korematsu, Mitsuye Endo, all of these people who challenged incarceration and the curfew. The 1980s apology from the Reagan administration, part of that pressure was applied from, I don't remember the name of the Japanese American researcher, but she was working in the archives and she uncovered the military report, which revealed that there was no military necessity. The U.S. military knew that the Japanese were not going to be able to really attack the West Coast, right? And so a lot of community action leads to this formal apology, and yet military necessity is still a legal grounds for the United States government to repeat these same kinds of actions. And it's important that we know this history, that we can look back and continue to think about how we might proceed.
And that gets to me, that's where how do you reach people, through the research room, through a film, through, I think, historical fiction. There's a place for that to talk from an information literacy standpoint, but everyone's not going to come conduct research.
Or maybe if the historians write well enough.
Well, yeah.
And people will read what we write.
No comment. But yeah, it's how do you engage people? Where do you reach them, and how do you get them into the story so that you can move into you can move into it in more depth.
Actually, and during your remarks, you had the painting up there, and that's another way that we do engage people. And obviously, Perrin, that's where your focus oftentimes is in the art, and how do we use these other ways of engaging people on the history.
That's a question.
Yeah, I guess.
How do we engage them?
Yeah.
I don't know. I do my little drawings, and I hope they like them. I think I do want to just, in terms of this question of assessing people through a modern lens, I do think in engaging people, I do some stuff on social media, and I have made videos, and I'm working on a book about animals. It's a different topic, but it has been my experience by and large, and I will say overall, that I really trust audiences. People are very smart. And so I think that it's a combination for me of presenting what the primary documents are, what the exchanges were, what happened, right? And we were having a conversation earlier about who has power over what gets archived, and how do we find what we need to know if it's gone missing. But I also think, this is part of this idea of judging the past by today's standards is part of why, Thanksgiving dinners can be a little spicy in my family when we're having conversations about these things, because obviously Roosevelt's love FDR. And there's things to be admiring of. And for me, I think the thing about it with these issues is she was not perfect, but there was also always Eleanor. And so if he was a man of his time and she was fighting it, then there are other options that have always been available.
Yeah.
To white people, especially, right? Like there was a different perspective being presented that she was learning through long-term relationship with people of color in real dialogue. And so I think, again, for me, searching for, Bill read the dissenting opinion. I think searching those out as we grapple with it now and remembering there's just as long a legacy of people pushing back to draw from.
Sorry.
No, I would agree. And what we see even with the Civil Rights Exhibit too is what is the arc? What is the course of people's life? How can we see whether they've changed, who they engage with, how they're navigating their times? I think sometimes that is a very powerful story too, that isn't us applying something then. It is us seeing that people are, in fact, grappling and evolving and changing, and how are they doing that? And then what does that say? What does that say then within the scope of their time in their lives?
Perrin, you kind of mentioned like social media and other ways to reach people. I think my kids are here someplace out there. I have a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old. Happy birthday to Mika tomorrow. But what would you say to them? What should someone of that age be taking away from being here today? What should they be learning about, whether it's the role of President Roosevelt or about this history? What is important about this day?
Well, we could look at the Japanese American Citizens League. So the Japanese American Citizens League comes into existence, and the leader, Mike Matsuoka, right, really urged Japanese Americans to be in compliance with the incarceration order, to be civically sort of obedient and compliant. He also urged Japanese Americans to volunteer to fight in World War II, that sort of by becoming hyper-Americans, then this is how you try to claim some sort of toehold, regain acceptance in the United States. And it was controversial then. Not everybody agreed. The JACL actually discouraged people from filing all of those civic lawsuits, right? But the JACL had become the leader of the Japanese American community because the earlier leadership, the immigrant leadership, had been systematically rounded up at the very beginning, right? And so we have a community that is decapitated, and you have sort of a younger generation of leaders coming forward trying to figure out, okay, how do we navigate this very difficult situation? There is no winning situation in this, but the JACL has also evolved since World War II, right? And I think adopts and really campaigns on behalf of major civil rights issues to this present day. For example, when instances of military necessity are used out there to sort of, I think this was especially used during the sort of the war on terrorism, the JACL is very, very proactive in terms of general civil rights issues, right? And so this is an example of an organization that has gone through a long history and sort of has been at the forefront really of trying to gain kind of restorative justice, but not just for Japanese Americans, much more broadly. And so we can adapt, we can learn, but it is about paying attention to certain kinds of issues and problems ongoing in American society.
I'll send you your check for your promotion. Phil,
No check, no check. Just give me one of those nice pins.
that I can do.
Well, I would add to that, too, that through whatever means one chooses to engage, I'm a dinosaur to some extent with when it comes to social media. But of course, our institution, and we recognize that value and importance. But to me, the lesson is very much along those lines, that the perfecting our system over time is you don't ever perfect it, right? It's never over. That one always must work and must engage, because you don't just achieve something and it's done. That the old rights granted aren't rights guaranteed. And so for young people, this is one example where you could put it in a box very neatly and set it over here. Well, this was done. We recognize it's terrible. And great, we've changed. When no, because if your organization is involved and spread out in its civil rights work, well, that's because it's all, intersecting.
That the moral arc of the universe bends slowly.
But you've got to
towards
keep
justice.
working to bend it.
Farron.
Well, and I've heard the term never again said multiple times today, and I think for me, in terms of a kind of personal, what is it that I need to do to get to never again? How do I need to participate in order to have never again be real? And what do each of us need to do? And I think for me, I am a nerd. My work is science, and I love sort of going into the archives and translating that. And so I am predisposed on multiple levels, including being raised with a sense of responsibility for history and continuing to participate in it, to really wanting to understand, how did we come to be in this moment right now? And again, whose stories weren't told? What did I not learn? What have we actively worked to forget as a nation? And so I do think continuing to focus on that there were always better ideas, there were always other options, the lack of inevitability in some of these things helps point me to the people that were leading in other ideas and other options. And part of why Citizen 13660 is so important to me is that it's a story of resilience and resistance inside an incarcerated experience. And that, I think, is really important for us to keep learning also.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? I believe Theo?
Okay. Ooh, wow, sorry. All right, we have a couple of questions that we can combine, and they have to do with geography. So outside of the West Coast relocation, how can we think about Japanese incarceration in Hawaii, where there were 3,000 incarcerated throughout the islands, and they represented a third of that territory's population? And then what about also Japanese experiences on the East Coast?
There were many contradictory situations which demonstrated that incarceration was kind of not a necessary set of actions. And so one was, you would think Hawaii, of any place, you would want to round up your Japanese Americans if there were really such threats, that Hawaii would be the place. Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, had already been attacked, and yet it didn't happen because Japanese Americans were found to be too sort of critical to the local economy, right? Another sort of contradiction in incarceration is that almost as soon as it starts, people start getting released. So you have people, there's a need for agricultural labor. They start releasing Japanese Americans from the camps so that they can work as agricultural laborers. There is this loyalty questionnaire that's enacted in, I forget if it was 1942 or 1943, but the loyalty questionnaire was implemented as a procedural way of determining who among the U.S. born, were concededly loyal. You had to sort of fill out this questionnaire and say, yes, I have never been loyal to the Japanese emperor. I'm only loyal to the United States. And yes, I am willing to serve in the U.S. military, right? This was all very confusing and difficult for Japanese Americans who had been placed in these incarceration camps. They didn't know if they were being tricked into saying, oh, well, maybe I used to be loyal to the emperor. And then it also asked women if they were willing to serve in the military. And so, but the ultimate goal was for the Japanese American incarcerees to answer yes and yes to those two key questions. If you didn't, if you tried to qualify it, saying something like, well, yes, I'd be willing to serve, but here I am in an incarceration camp, this was regarded as a black mark. But once you had filled that out, if you filled it out yes and yes, you could start being released to go to colleges in the interior of the United States, also on the East Coast. And then, of course, many people were then available to be drafted to serve in the military. And this was one of the, this was one of the chief goals. I forget the exact numbers of the 442nd Battalion, which was also combined with the Hawaiian unit. We have Japanese Americans who are serving in intelligence forces. They're sort of at all levels of the military. And, and I'm sure most of the people here know that for a battalion of its size, the 442nd has earned the highest number of recognitions for valor and for sacrifice, right? So unprecedented levels of just sort of commitment by people, many of whom were obviously ambivalent about what they were doing, but they understood that this was the way forward, that they could demonstrate to the United States their patriotism and their loyalty. And it has worked in the aftermath of the war, but who else is placed under those kinds of demands to demonstrate that, well, we are, part of the United States. So it, there was the incarceration was rife with contradictions and sort of just really unbearable kinds of choices that were presented to Japanese Americans.
Bill Barron, did you want to say anything?
Well, I would agree, because you see when the question of the incarceration of Italian or Japanese Americans arise too, there were significantly fewer, but also when, whole communities, when the largest, I think, ethnic background group in the United States were German Americans at one point, it again throws open the door that it is based on race. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just patently obvious.
So we have another question, something that Perrin raised concerning Never Again, about the cyclical nature of anti-Asian violence in the present, and it also it's a question as well for Bill. Since Asian Americans have been targeted so roundly during the COVID pandemic, how is it possible to link these multiple time periods, these multiple historical experiences with the present? How is it possible to think about countering xenophobia?
Well, from an institutional standpoint and from the work that we do, when, the direct and current connections become quite, well, we hope, but we certainly said we hope we provide the forum so that when we provide context for things in the past, and you can make a direct connection or at least see a similar atmosphere and outcomes occurring today and maybe in different ways, in more contemporary ways, that what our institution can do certainly is commit itself to programs and to engaging with communities and to having that forum where you can talk about history, but that history engages today so that we can draw people's attention to the fact that, look, the word progress is often thrown around, and of course there has been change, there has been movement, but again it goes to that, can we provide historical programming and context that engages younger people and engages communities today to say you can't take anything for granted, that one has to be aware and engaged in a community, and that organizations like ours can't be separate and apart from communities. They can't set up on a hill, and hand down wisdom. They've got to be actively engaged in the present through the lens and through the context of the past.
I mean, I feel like, what I've also gotten to learn today from Madeline is the ways in which this context of this racial prejudice already exists, and we see that this incarceration event is the most horrific possible outcome of like a bunch of different actors allowing it to go unchecked and not actively participating in shutting it down. And so I feel a personal responsibility in that sense, and then I think there need to be ongoing conversations like this about that linkage. I also, there was a moment when Trump first went into office where he referenced, I believe he was using language around the internment in speaking about immigration, and my cousin did an op-ed in the New York Times voicing, no, that's a never again. That is not something to emulate in a current administration. And I think people continuing to step up and say, never again, is really important.
I think, do we have time for maybe one more question, I think?
Sure. So this is for anyone on the panel, and it concerns the inside deliberations for the FDR's cabinet or the Senate or Congress. Who, if anyone, argued internally or quietly against the Executive Order 9066? How long did that debate last, if anyone knows the inside baseball of it? I mean, this is a town for inside baseball, right?
I have no idea.
Well, I won't necessarily list names, but what I will say is the idea and the thinking about whether people would be segregated or incarcerated was not new to December of 1941. What happened in December of 1941, of course, through early February was the growing chorus of alarm and fear and rumor and the frenzy of that, which was being fed back and forth from the media and the population to the media, to the elected officials, from the elected officials back to the people. There was this stew of opinion and fear and anxiety. So for those few who would, and there were those, and believe it or not, J. Edgar Hoover was one. One doesn't often think of as a voice of reason in many things. Was that this isn't, there's one, no evidence, and two, it's most likely, it would be in effect, I mean, it's sort of pointless. There's no evidence, and it's not going to serve any real purpose. So there were unexpected voices. Were they quiet? Did anyone want to stand up to public opinion, which is whipped up and developed and encouraged and spread on every level, from media to radio to everyday people in their communities to leadership? What strikes me is that's the moment that you take a deep breath and are silent for a second, and take one's counsel for decision making. It's probably very easy for me to sit here and say that. Very, very easy. But at the same time, that's when leaders get held accountable for their choices. And that's why, I'm sitting here on this stage today talking about this, because a leader in that moment didn't lead. And so that isn't washing away everything that was good about President Roosevelt or what he accomplished, but it is a frank acknowledgement that in all that noise, that the people who actually did counsel against it, and there were those in his own family as well as in the government, the Justice Department wanted no part of this. The Justice Department saw the flaws and the holes in this immediately. They were rather self-evident. And in that heated moment, it was a question in many ways of probably expedience. We're going to put this over here, and we've got a war to win. And unfortunately, and that's grotesque for me to even say it, but this is not anything we're going to worry about. We're going to do this, and now we're going to win the war.
So one of the things that happens in World War II is so international war is a kind of crucible in which for other Asian Americans, say Koreans, but then also Chinese, who shared the enmity against Japanese with the United States, it becomes then a way for them to become closer to mainstream so for Chinese Americans, for example, who sort of share the animosity to Japan because Japan has invaded China, World War II becomes a situation where for the first time you can be both a good Chinese and a good American by being anti-Japanese. And this is not to say all Chinese Americans were anti-Japanese, but many Chinese Americans made sure that they were not going to be confused with Japanese people, right? And the military service of Chinese Americans, and including my maternal grandfather, Chinese Americans served in integrated units, right? Unlike Japanese and unlike African Americans. And so this became a way for Chinese Americans actually, the Chinese exclusion laws, which we refer to, are repealed in the middle of World War II, in part because China is such an important ally to the United States. And so there are these shifts that happen because of this, but it's complicated.
Almost too complicated to handle in an hour discussion. It's very interesting you mentioned that. When we talk about anti-Asian hate today and everything, it's very interesting to see how things have evolved, and now Asian Americans are now seen as a single group, that you don't have the Japanese, Chinese, and a lot of that goes back to Vincent Chin, I think, when you had a Chinese man mistaken for being Japanese, was murdered because of that. And now we do have this concept of an Asian Pacific American versus all the different subgroups that we might have. Any last remarks before we close? I thank you very much for joining us today, particularly on a President's Day. To have the FDR Library here is particularly important, I think.
We're very pleased to be here and very honored.
Thank you for having us.
If there's anything you'd like to say in closing? Something I didn't ask you maybe or hasn't been asked that you wanted to make sure that you said today.
Reach out. We're a public resource. We want to reach out. Reach out to us. We're always willing to listen and learn. And if there's something wrong, that we're not getting it right, and we don't even know it, we're always happy to hear and engage.
I see our host.
Okay. Yes.
I mean, thanking our panelists. Thank you so much for this powerful conversation. Thanks to all of you. It makes all of our work important and all of our lives. As descendants, we have a few here who were incarcerated, or as survivors rather, as descendants, as we who hold material culture and archival information here at American History Museum with the Japanese American Incarceration Era Collection, with Righting a Wrong, an exhibit that opened here. It has gone to 14 different museums across the country that has an amazing curricula, high school level curricula attached to it through our Becoming Us program, but really through our ongoing work. So on this poignant and complicated anniversary, I hope you're inspired to think deeply, to act fearlessly, and of course, collaboratively, to use history as both an inspiration and an intense reminder of how we must constantly strive to be our best selves, to uphold the founding ideals of this nation, and to create a more just and compassionate future. Thank you all so much for coming, for spending part of your President's Day, fittingly a President's Day weekend. The museum is open till 5:30. And on a much lighter note, you can even pick up a handy handout, which is a scavenger hunt of sorts that historians always enjoy doing. You can find objects related to the broader Japanese American experience, including incarceration, here in the museum. So please, of course, be safe. Stay well, and thank you so much again. Thank you to our panelists.